Hi, if you found yourself here, you must be really interested in talking about the Panasonic GH7, Lumix, GH7, whatever it's called. Now, I truly thought there would never be a day where I became a Micro Four Thirds shooter. I've seen the videos, and you know, you can clock a Micro Four Thirds shooter a mile away, you know? The numbers, the formula, the equivalent focal lengths, you know, you can actually get the same depth of field if you just know how to, you know, here's the deal. Micro Four Thirds is not full frame. No one tries to compare 16 millimeter Super 16 to IMAX or, you know, 15 perf IMAX. They're very different tools for very different jobs and have different strengths and weaknesses. So knowing that, I thought just like, if I'm gonna buy a camera, I'm not gonna be able to afford a camera that I normally bring on set. I'm not gonna be able to afford a camera that can keep up with an Alexa Mini or Mini LF. But at the same time, I missed having a camera on hand, you know, the truly zero budget option for going out there and shooting something. And I thought to myself, what would someone shooting an ultra low budget film project shoot on? They shoot on Super 16. And that got me thinking, you know, what if I could build my own version of a digital Bolex? And I was looking at Micro Four Thirds, and the problem is Micro Four Thirds is a little bit too big, and the OG Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera is awesome, but you know, 1080p, Cinema DNG, you know, I just knew that it was gonna be a camera that was fun to pick up a few times, but had more headaches down the road. I started looking at the GH series, and you know, I've definitely met a few GH5 super fans and people who learned how to make films on these cameras. You know, I'd never really given them a chance, and I saw the GH7 and things started to click. It's one of the densest sensors on the market, which meant I could do a Super 16 crop and still get DCI 4K. While resolution isn't that important to me, I knew I wanted something that I could have a little bit of leeway with. You know, it had in-body stabilization, so I could have a really lightweight rig without a lot of shake. You know, it had internal ProRes 422, which is what, you know, I'm used to shooting ProRes 444 on the Alexa. It also has internal ProRes RAW. I never am really looking for the flexibility of RAW, but I'm simply looking for a very high bitrate detailed image with not a lot of chroma subsampling. You know, when you try to use qualifications on these MP4 formats, the image falls apart. You know, you cannot do a chroma qualification on H.264 or H.265. It is just atrocious. And so, you know, I do like to push the grade, and I knew with this digital Bolex it'd be some sort of pipeline that led to, you know, a sort of film emulation look. And so, you know, I'm still developing my post-processing pipeline for that film emulation. If I could, I'd be shooting everything on a little Bolex. I'd be shooting Super 16. I think, especially in the commercial landscape, there's so many eyes on the monitor, and you have to design it, you know, across departments that, for now, I'm kind of stuck in digital. But to help me with that post-production pipeline, I actually thought there was a smart way to get some on-set film reference that was pretty accurate to Super 16. Actually, let me show you. Okay, so we have little Minolta 16s. Minolta 16 is, they're kind of like also known as like spy cams. It's super small, even smaller than Olympus Stylus, you know, point and shoot 35mm camera. And what's cool about it is you actually load Super 16 film stock into the cartridge here and then take little on-set references. After, you know, we're set up for a shot, I would just pop this out, take a little film reference, and then, you know, develop it later in order to help inform some of those color decisions. Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't know, it's certainly cheaper. It's only about 5 feet that I can fit in one of these at a time. Developing it is pretty cheap. Scanning it is a little bit more expensive, so I need like a home scanner situation. This is Kodak Vision 3 50D, so it's a pretty low noise in terms of sensitivity, but it being Super 16 and probably just my handling of it, you get a lot of scratches. You get a lot more of those macro details than you do on a 35mm. I'll do a video on this one sometime. That's my plan for my post-production pipeline. And so yeah, I just saw it started to tick a lot of the boxes for me. I think the GH7 is great because I can go really deep with it, and I can push the camera, and it has more of a better tool set than most cameras. This, I got it for $1,600 with a rebate. That's insane. You know, the other cameras in this price bracket did not have the features that, you know, Lumix does, and it's a really low barrier of entry and a really high ceiling of how far you can push this thing. And so, you know, the Lumix body is incredibly robust and reliable. Haven't had any overheating problems here in Los Angeles. Now, you know, Panasonic Lumix, they've never been known for their autofocus, and the GH7 has autofocus improvements. I wouldn't know because I've paired it with Super 16 glass, vintage Super 16 glass from, well, here, I can show you. This is one of the lenses I have. It's an Ingenue 17 to 70. You know, it's aperture 2.2. This was the version that was made in America. There's also a version, obviously, that was made in France. I actually have this 55mm collar clamped around the edge of it that then adapts to 77mm for putting on filters on the front of this. The mount, I believe, is an RE bayonet, and then I've adapted that to Micro Four Thirds mount. And then the lens that you're looking at me through is the Schneider 10mm. There's loads of fairly affordable glass out there. Now, I knew that no Super 16 glass would really cover Micro Four Thirds, at least not at open gate. But then I realized I only needed a 14 or 15mm image circle to cover that Super 16 crop. However, it's nice to have a little bit of extra coverage. One, just so that you can use a slightly larger part of the image sensor and get a little bit more pixel resolution, but also when using the sensor shift image stabilizer inside the GH7, you lose even more of that image circle because now, as the sensor moves around, you start to see the sides of the image circle come into frame. You just have to know what you're getting into if you're gonna shoot, you know, Micro Four Thirds. It's got a different look than full frame. I grew up on full frame. I was kind of a part of that DSLR revolution, you know, back with the Canon back in the day, and that's how I'm used to framing my shots. You know, when I think of lenses, when I think of a 35mm or 50mm, I'm thinking of a pretty wide field of view. You know, that took some adjustment to get used from that sort of framing to then something like the Alexa Mini, which is Super 35, and now to Micro Four Thirds, and even further down to Super 16. You know, you kind of throw out some of your gut instincts out the window, but in some ways I was kind of looking for that. And, you know, when you don't have that sort of flexibility, you know, I kind of equate shooting full frame as playing if you're a musician, you know this, you know, playing the piano with a heavy foot in the pedal. You know, you can cover up a lot of mistakes. You can kind of glue things, bake things together pretty sloppily with that pedal. But if you have really good form, really good control over the keyboard, it actually challenges you to play without relying on that pedal so much. And so that's how I kind of feel like, you know, choosing Micro Four Thirds and Super 16 is forcing me to analyze how I actually frame up and block things. You know, you rely so much more on the geometry of the scene and the motions of the scene in order to draw the viewer's eye. And you can't just, you know, rely on nuking the background with depth of field in order to get the viewer to look at what you want them to look at. And so, yeah, that's a challenge, and that's kind of why I like it. And I think this is a camera that time is gonna be, you know, very forgiving, just because of that super dense sensor and, you know, the color that you can get off of it and the ways that you can interpret the color, you know, with RE Log C3 or however you want if you're shooting RAW, you know, and yeah, it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. We like it. We like that. Okay, so that's my spiel. I know it's just mostly a yap fest, but I thought, what a better way to start this channel than just to talk about what's right in front of me. Either way, just trying this out, so I'd love feedback. I'd love to talk about it. You know, I know there's a lot of hot takes with cameras out there. If Panasonic had the S1H Mark II, would I have gotten that? Yeah, it's quite possible. It's quite possible. But in the meantime, at least, I know that I have a tool that I'm growing with that, you know, I can bring to set, and no one has a camera that will give them the same look as this, and that, you know, helps me feel good about myself. Great, okay, so that is my GH7 video. I'll probably do it again. I don't really like this outfit anymore, so that's that. But yeah, I think that's good.